I think we'll get started now. Thank you everybody for coming to the Qualitative Research Methods lecture for the Shapiro summer students. My name is Nicole Bryce, and I am a researcher working with Nasia Safdar. She's an infectious disease doctor, and my work primarily focuses on qualitative research, mixed methods, and a lot of it is focusing on how to implement effective interventions to reduce healthcare associated infections. So that's kind of my background. And I am talking today about qualitative research. So first wanted to just contrast qualitative to quantitative. Quantitative is really focusing on the who, what, where, and why, identifying that, how many of these people, and in comparison, qualitative is asking more of the, well, why is what we're observing going on, and how is it happening? Qualitative focuses on words, whereas quantitative is more focused on numbers. For quantitative, you're really wanting to generalize, so for that reason, you're ideally sampling large samples of people randomly so that you're reducing bias and forms of confounding. And in contrast, in qualitative, it tends to be smaller and purposive, and what I mean by that is your sampling strategy is to actively seek out people who you think are most likely to have the most relevant experiences, perspectives, knowledge that relate to your research questions. And that's okay in qualitative. The point is not to generalize like it is in quantitative, it's to contextualize it. And analysis for qualitative is the process of identifying patterns and themes that are meaningful. Whereas in quantitative, you're really trying to establish statistical relationships where you can say, we're pretty certain that, because of our sampling strategy, this is what's causing this. And before I dig into what kind of the design process looks like for study design for qualitative, I just wanted to talk briefly about research paradigms, because if you go into the qualitative literature at all, you're going to probably encounter it. And one of kind of the challenges, I think, with qualitative is that qualitative research grew up in a bunch of different disciplines, so anthropology, psychology, a lot of the social sciences, and they all came up with their own lingo. And so that can make looking into the literature kind of confusing. And one thing a lot of qualitative researchers focus on is what's called a research paradigm. But as you'll see on the bottom, it's also referred to as a philosophical perspective, philosophical worldview, ontology, epistemology. But basically what it means is it's a personally held worldview that it's informed by your beliefs about the existence of an objective reality, what can be known, and how knowledge is acquired, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And this influences both qualitative and quantitative research, even though it's talked about mostly in the qualitative literature. And I'll try to provide some examples of what I mean there. So initially, when medical research was primarily focused on the quantitative side, kind of in the 50s era, the idea of positivism was the main paradigm. And this was that there's one objective reality that exists, and only that we can objectively measure or observe can be known. But once social sciences started emerging, and they were like, hey, we do think that there's some meaning in what I think of as elephant studies, where you can't quantitatively measure a lot of things, but you can make some assumptions based on the behaviors that you're observing. And they said, well, those behaviors that we're observing are meaningful, and they are knowledge, and we can kind of derive some meaning out of this world based on that. So that led to the transition to post-positivism, which is this idea that there is one objective reality, but we can never fully know this reality because it's so complex, and a lot of things are not, you can't quantify them. There's no good measure. But we can try to approximate it, and through this process of peer review, we can try and identify these biases and contradictions and come closer to this understanding of what is this objective truth. And then some researchers, as they went further, felt that post-positivism didn't quite fit what they thought and moved into, and this is where a lot of terminology comes in, but like a lot of times it's most commonly called critical theory, constructivism, or interpretivism. And this is the idea that there is not one objective reality. And I always struggled when I was looking in the literature on this because it gets really philosophical really quickly. But the best I can break it down is that like they believe in these virtual realities that are individually or co-created. And research then is co-created, or knowledge is co-created between the researcher and the participant. And their differences in understanding are resolved through dialogue and reasoned argument. And I always kind of struggled with that, but I think the analogy that, it's not a perfect analogy, but that has kind of helped me is, I'm thinking many of you have probably heard about, there's been a lot of talk about media bubbles lately, about how because of all the social media and the way we consume information, and there's so much information out there, we tend to fall into bubbles where everybody on our Facebook page tends to view the same media and from the same sources, and so we see the world very differently, and we all think that our reality is the true reality. And so kind of cutting out the orange and red boxes are kind of this is just a chart I found online. I don't really know the methodology she used, but basically it was charting the level of bias. So if we look kind of at this, it's kind of a bell curve of like the fair interpretations of the news, and then what she categorized as news. People who are consuming news on this side probably have a very different worldview than people on this side, and they're not necessarily, I think the constructivists would say, they're not necessarily wrong. And if you the analogy is everybody has different experiences of varying ranges of extremes. So I think the post-positivists would say, well, the truth is somewhere in the middle, and by pointing out biases in these articles or in the research that we're doing, we'll come to the middle, where constructivists will say, we're all in the bubble, so none of us can say what is the objective reality. Does that make any sense? It's just, the only reason I'm pointing it out is that it influences, and I think it's important to be aware as you're designing your qualitative study, to be aware that there's multiple ways to look at knowledge and to know kind of how, and it influences how you design it, and just take that into account. And I'll try to point it out as we go through this. So the plan for today is I'm going to go and just try and give a brief overview of qualitative study design, probably for the next 20, 30 minutes. And then I've got an exercise that I'm hoping will make things for coding, make things a little bit more concrete about what that process looks like. I want this to be interactive. If things don't make sense, please feel free to interrupt me, ask questions, and I'll be asking for some participation as well. So qualitative study design, I found this framework to be helpful. It's a framework by Maxwell, and what I like about it is it's not linear, and as we go through this, I hope to kind of show that it's kind of, as you're designing a qualitative research study, all of these different influences or concepts kind of, there's a push and pull as you're designing. You don't just go from goals, research questions. You might start with overall goals, and then you start designing your research questions, and then you look at how feasible things are. So I like how all of these elements are important, but there's kind of a push and pull throughout where you'll kind of adjust to figure out what's the best way to do it. And because research is all about collaboration, I've added this very professional addition to it, just to kind of show how I view the paradigm, research paradigm views it. As you're designing your study, your paradigm is going to influence how you look at the world and how you design this. So to start with, let's focus on goals. There are 3 types of goals, and generally you'll have all 3 types of these goals going on as you are designing a study. So personal is what motivates you to do the study. So this could be a desire for change, interest, curiosity, a preference for a certain research type. You just like doing qualitative research, so you tend to gravitate towards that. Career advancement, personal experiences, totally valid reasons, but important to, everyone has them, but it's important to examine the ways in which they could affect the validity of your results, because if you're not realizing how your desires for career advancement are influencing your decisions, that could introduce bias. And then there's practical. What do you want to accomplish? Why is this worthwhile to do? So generally, it's trying to meet a need, changing a situation that you find problematic, or achieving some sort of objective. And then there's the intellectual or scholarly goals that you have. So what do you want to understand? What is interesting to you about this? And a lot of times your personal goals are going to overlap with your practical and intellectual goals, because what you're interested in, you wouldn't be studying it if you weren't interested in it. And so you'll see that I've had, one of the handouts is an excerpt from a podcast. It's an interview that isn't a qualitative research interview, but I felt like it shared enough of the traits that it would be a useful example to use. And so I'll kind of use this HIV example throughout while we go through this. So do you guys have any ideas of what might be some goal, like pretend that you are an HIV researcher, what might be some goals that you'd have? Anybody? That would like lead you to qualitative research? No ideas? So like,
I would want to understand, I guess, why there isn't 100% adherence to antiretroviral therapy.
That's a great one. And so, yeah, and other similar ones might be increasing testing rates in a certain population, or treatment rates, access to treatment. So there's a lot of different ways goals that you might have. And the reason why I think it's important to have your goals clearly in mind is that you want to be clear about what you're trying to solve and what you're doing there, and I think that helps make it easier to figure out the path, the best path of getting there. And so these are some questions that you might want to ask yourself as you're defining your goals for your qualitative study. So next we'll move on to research questions. And so research questions are important because they explain specifically what you're hoping to learn or understand as the result of your study. They also help to focus your study because there's a lot of different directions that you could go. And they give you some guidance on how you conduct your study. When you're formulating research questions, questions that address your intellectual goals tend to be more feasible to answer than those that attempt to address practical goals directly. So a practical goal for the HIV example might be, how can we design a program that increases HIV testing rates in at-risk men who have sex with men, or MSM? An intellectual goal that's related to that would be, what factors influence whether at-risk MSM undergo testing for HIV/AIDS. And I think that the second one's is a lot easier to figure out, like, how are we going to design the study, because the practical one is so broad as where do you start? How do we design the study? And so the kind of the strategy I recommend is that tending to address find questions that address your intellectual goals that will then lead to knowledge that will help you achieve your practical goals. And it's not a hard and fast rule. It definitely depends on your study. That's kind of both the beauty and the curse of qualitative, is that there's no one size fits all. And so, again, you want to make sure that your research questions are appropriately focused. Avoid unexamined assumptions. So make sure you're not assuming that the people you're talking to believe a certain thing or have certain experiences. That they answer what you aim to answer. So are they tied to your goals? Is there a clear line between that? And are they aligned with what's already known in your tentative theories about the phenomenon? And then validity, this piece is important because it's why should your results be believed? And so if you're thinking about this throughout, you're more likely to design a study in a way that is believable. So when the people read it, they're like, yeah, that makes sense. The people you talk to, that seems like a good plan of action. So I think from the beginning, that's something good to think about. Another thing is, what biases am I bringing to the study? And everybody has biases, and it's based in, everybody has different experiences and perspectives. And that's just a part of human nature, but it's important to be able to be aware of them. And one way that you might become more familiar with what your own biases are is Harvard has a study that they're doing where you can go online and they have a set of implicit biased tests that you can take. And so if you're designing a study, you might want, I looked at the list, it was like at least 20 or 30 different categories, religion, race, different things. And so go on there and take the test and see where you land kind of on the bias scale, and that'll just help you to be more cognizant as you're doing your study of what you're bringing into the study, what biases, and kind of questioning that as you go along. And then how will my actions as a researcher influence participants' behavior or responses, and then how can you minimize that? How will the data support or challenge your ideas, and how might your results and conclusions be wrong? If you're thinking about this throughout, you're more likely to address things and make changes in your design that can help make your results more valid. And then the next element of this model is the conceptual framework or methodology. And I think for a long time, this is what I found most confusing or kind of overwhelming about qualitative research. And the main reason is that there's just a ton of them. But basically, once I realized that methodology is basically your conceptual framework, and it's telling you what you want to look at and how to collect the data. There is so much information out there. This is what helps you narrow to be like, what's important for this specific research question, and how can I best get it? And like I said, there's a ton of methodologies out there, and I think that's the hardest part, is that at least I've never been able to find like some table that's like, if you're doing this kind of qualitative study, these are the best methodologies. And so when you're just entering the field and you don't know what the options are, it can be a bit overwhelming. But a lot of the common ones are ethnography, phenomenology, grounded theory, case study, or an orientational inquiry, which would be like a feminist framework or queer. Also, it can just be the more like the conceptual frameworks for a specific disease that is accepted in your field of study, where they have, and I'll show that in a little bit. And the degree of prescriptiveness on the what and how varies across the methodologies. It also sometimes is called the approach. So I'll give some examples to hopefully make it a little clearer. So ethnography, the what in that is culture. So, and it's defined very broadly. It could be ethnicity, geography, workplace, any group or organization that has a shared characteristic. And then how, this ethnography grew out of anthropology. So it traditionally is done primarily through observation using field notes. And this is where your research paradigm kind of would come in. So post-positivists, because they think there's an objective reality that can be studied, they kind of view themselves as the outside observers, whereas constructionists view themselves as part of the study itself. They think that there's no way to not influence the study as you go in. So they're always observing, how does my interactions with the people I'm observing influence them? So in the HIV example, some ways you might do this if you were, kind of because it's an illness that has traditionally been associated with gay men or men who have sex with men. You might, if you're doing a study that's focused on, you want to understand culture as it relates to answer some question related to HIV, you might observe a support group or an HIV clinic or a gay bar or something to get a sense of how that impacts some question you have about HIV. Grounded theory is the one that I think you'll see a lot in the literature. I think people tend to use elements of grounded theory, but not use the full methodology. The full methodology is really focused on theory development. So it involves looking at some specific phenomenon and saying, what is going on here? What are the elements that are important to know about it? And a lot of times, the initial questions for grounded theory, if there's no pre-existing theory, is just what is going on here? And you ask very broad questions, and then you narrow them as you go, and then a grounded theorist throughout their career would build upon this theory and make it broader. And so they might start with looking specifically at migraines, like what is the experience of, resiliency in people that experience migraines. And they build a theory around that. And then they might expand it out later in their career once they have a pretty well-designed theory to what is the experience of resiliency, or how do these people experience resiliency in chronic disease, with migraines being a part of that. And the how is very prescriptive in grounded theory. It's a very iterative process that involves the development of questions, and you build upon your interviews, and as important themes emerge, you purposively recruit additional people that might have additional information relevant to that. And so a lot of people, I think because methodologies are so blurry in the literature, I think because this is concrete, I think a lot of researchers have been drawn to this of being, and say they're doing grounded theory, but grounded theory, if it's done in the traditional way, involves a very large sample size, generally in the double digits, if not triple digits. And so when I see a study that said, we did grounded theory, we had 8 subjects, I'm a little bit skeptical that they were actually using it. So just something to be aware of. And so like with the HIV example, you might want to build a theory of testing behaviors of at-risk MSM. And then this is an example of one of the, more visual frameworks that you could use. And then the what would be these different elements, perceived susceptibility, disease, perceived severity, and that would be what you would be looking at. And the how would kind of depend on what your research question is. So questionnaires, interviews, observation, any of those could be relevant. And so then some questions to consider when you're selecting a methodology. What do you think is going on with the issues, setting, or people that you plan to study? What theories, beliefs, prior research findings, or experiences will guide or inform your research? So this is where looking into the literature and doing a literature review, your prior research, your prior knowledge of it will come in. And that might help you find a framework that would be appropriate to use. What assumptions are you making about the issues, settings, or people you plan to study? And then what methodology or combination of methodologies provides the best frame of reference? You can combine them if it makes sense. If you wanted to use the health belief model, but then use a grounded theory to build on that model and say, well, we assume this is the theory of behavior, and we're going to build it for this specific or topic that is completely reasonable. And then the final piece of this is methods, and that's kind of the nitty-gritty of how are you going to collect the information that you need to answer your research question. And there's three main ways to do it, as I've kind of alluded. Observations, interviews, either individual or focus group, I kind of lump those together, and then document review. So observations, they can be collected in person or via audio or video recording. It requires some sort of documentation of important evidence related to the research question. So it could be field notes, checklists, transcripts of recordings, something that on paper that you can kind of go to pull meaning out of. And then this is where your methodology is really important. It's important to define ahead of time what should be considered important evidence that will help you answer your research questions. So if you think about if you just sit in a busy hall sometime and try to do an observation and try to write down everything that you see, it's impossible. And so this is where it's important to kind of narrow it down and know specifically what you're looking for and what is relevant. Not only because it makes it easier to collect the data, but also you're collecting it more systematically and you're not accidentally leaving out stuff that's important. But again, you want to be careful not to define this so rigidly that you're overlooking or ignoring things that are important to your research question, because the framework you may be using might be missing a piece. So just be aware of that, but I think it's helpful to kind of narrow and be thinking, always have your research question in your mind as you're observing of, does this have any meaning in relation to that? So then individual and focus group interviews. Individual interviews is where an interviewer sits down with a participant, generally for about 30 or 60 minutes long, pretty much always audio recorded, or sometimes, depending on the situation, notes, but consent, and you generally have to obtain consent prior to recording. And like I said, purposive sampling is used, so you seek out those participants that have relevant background and experiences. There's three main types of individual interviews. Structured, which is where participants are asked the exact same questions. They're primarily close-ended questions, so this would be those like telephone calls or surveys where you're trying to get information. These aren't as relevant to qualitative research. You might have some open-ended questions that you ask with no follow-ups, and I think that would fall into that. Semi-structured is by far the most used, and I think makes the most sense for most qualitative researchers. You generally have several pre-planned questions, but then depending on what your respondent says, you follow up on those questions based on what your important themes are and what you think is important for your study. And then unstructured is few to no pre-planned questions, but this type requires significant practice and skill to do well. So generally, it's qualitative researchers that have been doing it a while, and generally used more in a spontaneous context where you're in a clinic and you just grab people when you can and try to get information. So then focus group interviews are similar to the individual in that the facilitator uses a topic list or questioning route to guide the conversation. And then generally you have another study member taking notes and assisting with the group. Generally they run a little bit longer, 60 to 90 minutes. Again, audio recorded and consent is obtained prior to recording. The general rule of thumb, depending on the topic, is 6 to 8 participants is ideal, but generally you don't want any more than 10 because then it's just too hard to hold a conversation together, and certain people, the quieter people, kind of get left out. Again, you use purposive sampling. In most cases, you want the group to be homogeneous, meaning that they have similar characteristics and can relate to one another on the topic. I don't think this is a hard and fast rule. I think the main thing you want to be concerned about is being aware of hierarchies that might exist or other factors that might influence how willing people are to talk in a group with one another. And they're generally, I think, tend to be preferred because over individual interviews because they're more efficient. But it really depends on the research topic and what you're trying to get out of it. The real benefit of focus groups is that interaction and the people being able to build on each other's experiences and ideas. And if your topic isn't something where that seems like it would happen very easily, individual interview might be more appropriate. And again, with polarizing or stigmatized topics where people might have really strong feelings or not feel comfortable sharing personal details, individual would be more appropriate. How am I doing on that? Okay. So I think by far the hardest question and the question that every qualitative researcher asks is how many do I do? Because when you're writing a grant, you kind of have to know. And when you're trying to plan a study, it's an important thing to plan on. And the frustrating thing is that there's no hard and fast number. It really depends on the complexity of your research questions and the methodology that you're using. Like I mentioned, grounded theory is one of those that requires a big number of interviews. So the answer, which can be a little infuriating, is as many as you need to answer your research questions. So my main advice is just to kind of use a range for IRB protocols. Say we'll do X to X and have the higher end of it be what you hope is an overestimate, and budget for that in a grant for that higher end. And then if you answer the question earlier, great. But it's hard to predict, and that trying to nail down a number ahead of time can be really hard. So when you're doing interviews, you really want the advantage of it over quantitative is that ability to explain and to tell the why and the how behind the things that you're observing. So you're wanting to get detailed, rich, and deep data that's vivid. So having anecdotes and examples is a sign of having some strong data. Nuance, so you can kind of understand the limit of concepts and draw a line around what exceptions there are related to a phenomenon. You want it to be obviously trustworthy, and then salient, so meaningful to both the participants and the researcher. And then interview questions, as you're designing those interview guides, try to use the participants' language, and you may even do this on the fly in an interview. You notice that they're using it, but as you're designing the question, instead of saying, when was your last COPD exacerbation, you'd say, when was the last time you had problems breathing, or something like that. So trying to take out the technical jargon and use the language that you think the participant would use. Simple, straightforward, and easy to say. If you're stumbling over the words and it's a long question, chances are it'll be hard for the person you're interviewing to interpret what you're trying to ask them, so try to simplify as much as possible. Don't unnecessarily limit participants' responses, so try to make them all open-ended and avoid yes or no questions. I think it's fine to ask yes or no if you're trying to, like, have you had X experience, so that you know if your next question is relevant, but then have a question to be like, oh, if they say yes, say, okay, what was that like, and know what that follow-up question is. Questions that I see a lot in interview guides are questions of degree, so like, how satisfied were you with this? That's, in my mind, is basically just a Likert type scale verbally, except you don't have the standardized on a scale of 1 to 5. So your answers are not going to be very rich. They're going to say, well, I was pretty satisfied, kind of satisfied. And if you have a very talkative participant, they might go deeper and tell you a story that's richer. But if you have someone who's more reticent, you're going to get pretty surface level that's like, it was okay, it was all right. So, and then it's hard to interpret that when you're trying to analyze your data. One-dimensional, only ask one thing at a time. Don't assume anything about the participants, their experiences or their views. Don't imply any judgment, and that's why I've read a lot in the literature that you shouldn't use why questions. I think you can use why questions, you just have to be careful and make sure that the participant is not going to interpret it as you're like questioning their judgment or making a judgment about why they did something. And then they should be different than your study's research questions. So don't just go there and ask them your research question. Why don't you get tested for HIV? Ask questions that'll elicit those answers, and I'll go into that a little bit more depth. So one of the handouts that you guys have is that interview excerpt, and it's from a podcast where he was interviewing him about the AIDS epidemic or HIV epidemic after I believe it was right after they cured one person from HIV. And so looking at that and kind of based on what I've said about interview questions and interview data, what do you notice about it? What's good, what's bad, what could be improved?
I'm just noticing off the top, there are several questions that are asked by Michael.
Mm-hmm.
And his intention is to kind of stimulate a narrative. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a different intention than trying to get very discrete answers about particular questions that will allow you to shed some light on a research question. But just in terms of noticing some differences to the qualities of strong questions.
Yeah, he kind of lumps multiple questions together. Anybody else have some observations? Well, some of the things that I think are good about it is that he is eliciting a narrative. And I think for a research question, it actually is very helpful to have somebody tell you an anecdote. So you'll notice that a lot of the things that the guy is saying, he's talking about, well, this is a story of when I decided to get tested and what happened before that. And from that, you can draw out he was watching a movie, he noticed similarities there. And so that's good. And then I think looking also at the ratio between how much the interviewer is talking and the respondent is talking, what do you notice there? Well, the respondent's talking a lot more than the interviewer. And I think that is, when you're looking at your interview transcripts when you get it back, that's a good sign when you see big chunks of text. I mean, you can, some text, you can interject with but if you're coming back and you're talking about equally as your respondent, you might want to think about kind of refining your questions. And that's the nice thing about qualitative is if questions aren't working, and sometimes the only way to really know if they'll work is to test them out in an interview setting, or with kind of some test interviews ahead of time, then reconfigure them, see what's not working. If they're answering a different question than what you're getting at, you can feel it's not like quantitative where it's going to mess up your results because you didn't ask things consistently ahead of time. So just some things to think about. And even though he was asking double questions and maybe some of his questioning technique wasn't the best, he was still able to elicit some really good information. And so I just want to point out that you don't have to be a perfect interviewer. It's more just, a lot of it is trying to just set up that rapport and making people feel comfortable. But you don't have to be perfect at this, so I don't want to scare people off from interviewing with all this list of do's and don'ts. And I got to hurry up. So then document review. This is text and images recorded without a researcher's intervention. In health sciences, this could be like a medical record or patient portal notes, content on health and patient support websites like Patients Like Me, care team procedural documents, and they can be used alone or to enrich the findings of other data collection methods. And I think with this type of data, because you have less control over how it's made, you really want to place it in its context and evaluate how complete or selective is it, who authored the document, what's their perspective, what are their motivations, why was it produced, and who was the target audience. Those will just help you to kind of place it into context and determine their meaning and value. And so when you're selecting methods, basically, I feel like it's this push and pull of what is going back to what is the most valid way to do this. Qualitative methods, is it a mix of methods? Would some quantitative data help? There's a lot of flexibility here. And then what sampling strategy makes the most sense? And I feel like that's it's good to just kind of dream and be like, in an ideal situation where money and time and staff are not an issue, how would I do this? And then how much time and money do I have available? And how can I what's the best balance of that? Because you're never going to be able to do the ideal. I wish you could, but it's very rare that you can do the very best of everything, just because we live in the real world and there's limited resources. So, and then how will you make sense of the data once it's collected? And then finally, data analysis. So this tends to vary based on your methodology, but in general, it involves assigning codes to text that's relevant to the research questions, sorting codes to identify similarities, differences, relationships, patterns, and themes. You're doing the analysis concurrent with data collection, like I said, so that if you're finding that some of the questions aren't working, you can revamp them for future collection. And use of analytic memos or informal notes. This is to kind of document your thought process. And then making tentative assertions and generalizations. There's a number of software programs that you can use to facilitate this process: In Vivo, Deduce. I view them as kind of analogous to SAS or R in quantitative. They can only help you store, organize, or visualize the data. They're not going to do the analysis for you. And I think, and then if you have multiple people involved in the analysis, it can help you determine the consistency in coding by calculating inter-rater reliability. So just some tips. Do it at the same time, like I said. Allow lots of time. It is time consuming. Resist the urge to count. I think that it can be, if somebody's saying it a lot, that is important to note, and you can talk in broad generalizations, but generally, because you're not asking everything in the same way and collecting it in the same systematic way that you do with quantitative, numbers are not appropriate or meaningful. Include as many perspectives as you can, if possible. I know that kind of feasibility runs in there. And then carefully document your process so you can justify the decisions that you make. So just to give an example of coding, and actually I'm going to ask you we're going to do a little exercise there. So Elise is handing out an exercise we're going to do where we're going to code based on a hypothetical study based on the health belief model. And so I wanted first to kind of just demonstrate how your coding is going to be completely different depending on your methodology, and that's okay. It's going to be different from person to person, even within the same methodology and same study, and that's okay. You generally come back together, your research team, multiple people, code a transcript, and then you come together and kind of compare how you coded, and that's how you, and then generally what you do is you create a code book. It can be in Excel, where you have code names, and then you describe what pieces of text you code within there. And so for the health belief model, the handout kind of shows describes the, and I'll give you time to read that in a moment, but I wanted to give an example. This is kind of the old-fashioned way that they coded back in the 80s before there were computers, was that, so we're gonna do it that way just for feasibility's sake. But you go and look at the pieces of text and code them based on where they fit. And some pieces of text might not be relevant. But for this, I thought cues to action was relevant for this because he's referring to the media. Still in college is demographic. It seemed like a strange mystery. He's referring to AIDS. So perceived susceptibility, that's kind of how he perceived the AIDS at that time. Not sure how applicable. I was a closeted homosexual, so I didn't use all of the codes. It was just for example's sake. But just for contrast's sake, like for grounded theory, the coding looks a lot different. In that the initial round of coding, you're just basically describing what the text said. So a lot of times you try to use ing words. So hearing about AIDS, being in college, seeming strange, and so you can see that kind of looks a lot different. And then queer theory focuses a lot on identity and power dynamics, and so those are your big constructs in there. And that's a little bit more freeform because it's not as defined as the health belief model, but you go in and things that related to identity, you might start categorizing. So education, closeted, feelings about AIDS. And so I just wanted, my main point there was that it looks different based on your question and what your methodology is. So I went a little over, but we still have about 12 minutes. If you guys want to look at that handout that Elise just handed out, it provides a little bit more detailed information about the health belief model and a hypothetical study looking at where the practical goal is to increase HIV testing rates in at-risk MSM. And the intellectual goal is to understand what factors influence that. So if you want to read through that and then kind of try with that, with the interview text, your hand at some coding, and maybe I'll give you guys, let's say about 7 minutes, and then we'll come back and talk. And if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand and I'll come down. What was it like? What questions came up? Did it make sense? No questions? Were you able to find pieces of text that felt like they fit into the different categories? Okay. Did anybody find pieces of text that didn't quite fit in but you felt were important?
Yeah, I feel like it's very easy for it to become like subjective. Because he says, like, for instance, fortunately I had a gay doctor in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then, would you then say that, based on how he words that in the context of not having a gay doctor would be a perceived barrier or judgment?
Mm.
So it becomes
Yeah.
pretty quick.
Yeah. And it's going to be subjective because you're bringing in, you have to make some analytical judgments throughout the process. But that's why, if possible, you want to bring in as many perspectives, and generally the coding process or the analysis process involves, at least the way I've done it before, is you'll have everybody on the research team code the first maybe 5 interviews separately, and each time after you code an interview, you come together in a group and you say, and you start with maybe a kind of bare bones code book, where you say these are kind of the things that we're looking for, and then code other things that seem important. And then you come together and compare how you coded, and compare and contrast, and then talk it through and say, well, I think that that was a perceived barrier, not having a gay doctor. And then somebody else could say, oh, I never thought of it that way. I don't think it really is, because I view perceived barriers as X. And you kind of hash it out that way, and you end up with these multiple iterations of a code book where you, at each meeting, kind of document. And I used to sometimes take a recorder so that I could go back and remember, go through and the decisions that we made about code so that we weren't forgetting them and then going back to coding a different way. But yeah, you're right, it's very subjective, and it does, I think, especially at first, feel super mushy. And it's going to be, but as long as you're kind of using a systematic process where you're trying to bring in a lot of voices and pull meaning out of it, you'll be able to justify the decisions that you make. So does that make sense? Okay, any other questions, comments, concerns? Okay, well, I did have a piece on mixed methods if we had time, but we only have 2 minutes left, so you can look at that if you like. But thank you for coming, and if you have any questions that you want to talk about separately, please feel free to come up.
Thank you.